The daily life of a sniper, how fascinating could it be? Killing one person with one shot every day. No lingering troubles. When the target was still struggling in agony, the observer immediately stepped forward to confirm their identity. Then he fired 3 consecutive shots to finish off the opponent. But just as Rahman's team determined the mission was complete, a bullet from the darkness struck the observer. Clearly, in this snowy area, besides them, there were others lurking in the shadows. Seeing the observer unexpectedly shot in the head, the sniper didn't dare to hesitate and immediately fled. However, something even more terrifying was yet to come. This forest contained an indescribable atmosphere, and he was about to encounter a great disaster. Time needed to rewind a little. Once, when Raymond's team was on a mission in Afghanistan, they had just shot the target in the head. But as they were preparing to retreat, Sniper Brian suddenly noticed that the target, whose head had just been blown off, stood up again. This made him wonder if he had missed. However, when he raised his scope to check, he found the lifeless body still lying motionless on the ground. Brian thought he had misseen and didn't think much of it. Then he and his teammates retreated from the scene together. A few days later, Rahman's team returned to the U.S. Brian had a beautiful wife like a flower and a lovely, understanding daughter. They were a happy family in everyone's eyes. For Brian, who frequently carried out missions, returning home was an immense luxury. He hadn't seen his daughter for a long time. When he saw her, he immediately broke into a radiant smile. However, happy times are always too short. Early the next morning, as the family was making breakfast, Brian's superior unexpectedly called. That afternoon, he was forced to return to the operations center and had to embark on a new mission within 15 hours. Although he had been home for less than 24 hours, military orders were absolute, so Brian had to pack his bags and immediately return. The person accompanying him on this mission was still his old teammate, Miller. After passing through a maze-like corridor, the two followed the officer in charge, Boehm, to the basement. Clearly, this mission was extremely top secret. They were about to be dispatched to the frigid northeast of Ukraine because there was a group of Russian-backed separatists there. Although most of them had surrendered to the Ukrainian army, one person was still trying to rekindle the war between the two sides. That was this mission's target, named Ike. The officer in charge stated that although the U.S. was not directly involved, they had to prevent Ike from causing conflict again. Therefore, Brian and his teammate needed to infiltrate Ukraine and covertly eliminate IKE. Intelligence indicated that the target was injured in a skirmish and was currently hiding in a wooden house near the border to recover. The two only needed to ambush outside the target's building and kill IKE on sight. But the crucial issue was that this time they were operating in Ukrainian territory, and the U.S. military could not provide them with support. The only things they could use were their own eyes and the satellite overhead. Brian realized that things were not that simple, and he immediately asked if headquarters had sent another team ahead of them. The officer in charge, seeing that he could no longer hide it from the two, had to tell the truth. It was true that a team had been sent a month ago, but those two snipers had to withdraw urgently for a special reason before they could even approach the wooden house. They hadn't even spotted the target or obtained other classified information, which the officer in charge said could not be disclosed and wouldn't help their operation anyway. Due to the tight schedule and urgent mission, Brian felt like he was in a difficult position. The two didn't even have time to evaluate the mission before being put on a plane to the target. After many hours of flying, they landed safely in Ukrainian territory. This location was over 10 kilometers from the target building. They both had to walk to the wooden house before dark. During their break, Brian looked at the forest in front of him and fell into thought. He guessed that the reason the previous team failed was probably due to unfamiliarity with the terrain. To avoid repeating the failure, Brian suggested marking some places here to facilitate returning by the same route when the mission was over. But just as the two were busy in the snow, Brian suddenly saw a figure staring at him from a distance. In a panic, he raised his scope to aim. But when Miller heard the sound and turned around, he said there was nothing behind the tree, not even footprints. However, Brian was very sure that he had just seen a figure, but the most important target right now was IKE. The two didn't have time to think much, and after making the markings, they continued onward. Not long after, Raymond finally reached the outer perimeter of the wooden house. Brian set up his sniper rifle and saw someone moving through the window. But before confirming that it was the target, they couldn't fire indiscriminately because the nighttime temperature here was extremely low. Brian guessed that EKE would come out for firewood. So he told Miller to move to a spot closer to the firewood pile. Once the target was confirmed, they would immediately open fire and kill him. Unexpectedly, at this moment, Brian suddenly heard a strange cry echoing from the forest behind them. Before he could understand what was happening, the cry mysteriously disappeared again. Brian didn't have time to think much, quickly adjusting his state to track the target. The two ambushed in the snow for an entire day. When it started to get dark, the old man finally stepped out of the house. Based on the target description provided by intelligence, a bald man around 50 years old with a white goatee. They determined that the person in front of them was indeed the target, IKE. When Brian pulled the trigger, the old man was shot through the heart and died instantly. After successfully eliminating the target, the two immediately called headquarters to request extraction. But what they didn't expect was that the helicopter didn't arrive as scheduled. As Raymond's team wondered, headquarters suddenly informed them that the target was not dead yet and was currently leaving the wooden house area. Excluding the possibility of the target being shot dead and coming back to life, the only explanation was that they had killed the wrong person. This immediately stunned Brian because before firing, he and Miller had carefully compared the physical characteristics. He had only pulled the trigger after full confirmation. But headquarters insisted that the target was definitely still alive and ordered them to stay put and wait for orders until they received new mission directives. Killing the wrong target filled Brian with guilt. Miller comforted him, saying that collateral damage situations like this were very normal. If there were errors in the information provided by intelligence, the responsibility naturally did not lie with the sniper. After waiting all night, headquarters still hadn't issued new orders. The two slept the night in the snow. Miller couldn't take it anymore and called headquarters. But the Doifong's answer was the same as yesterday. Still waiting to confirm the target's location, Miller thought they were being made a fool of. To resolve the doubts in his mind, Brian decided to return to the wooden house to see for himself who had been killed last night. Although Miller advised that it wasn't necessary, he couldn't resist Brian's repeated insistence. After confirming with headquarters that no one was around, Miller had to go with him. When they returned, they found the body still in the same place, and its physical characteristics completely matched the information in the briefing. To clarify who this person really was, Raymond's team carefully entered the house, trying to find something that could prove the identity of the deceased. After searching everywhere, besides an unloaded hunting rifle hanging on the wall, there was nothing suspicious inside the house. By this point, the Rain team basically believed they had killed the wrong person. And then, the identification papers found on the table confirmed their suspicion. This person was not the target, but a local resident. Brian was filled with remorse upon learning the truth. Just as he was tormented by this, headquarters suddenly sent a message. 3 armed gunmen were rapidly approaching the wooden house, currently 2 kilometers southwest of their position. The two had to quickly leave this area, but at this moment, Brian heard a knocking sound echoing from inside the house. He moved towards the sound, opened the window, and saw the wooden door of the shed outside opening and closing by itself for no clear reason. Just as he was engrossed in observation, Miller called his name loudly. This brought Brian's thoughts back. Then Raymond's team quickly opened the door and left, running at top speed to the nearby forest to observe. Not long after, they saw the 3 armed gunmen appear in front of the wooden house on a snowmobile. Unexpectedly, Brian heard that strange cry again at this moment. But when he turned around, there was nothing behind him, and Miller also said he didn't hear any sound. The Rain team didn't have time to think much and continued to observe. They saw the woman in the team approach the body. When she saw the opponent's tragic death, her face immediately showed an expression of pain. Clearly, they knew each other. The woman took off her hood and looked around, trying to find the killer of her teammate. Fortunately, Brian and his teammate ran quite fast, so the opponent did not detect their movements. After reaching a safe area, Brian immediately reported their position to headquarters. But the answer he received was still to stay put and wait for orders. The two felt they couldn't continue to sit and wait like this. If those 3 had eyes and ears, they could very likely be pursued all the way here. But just as Raymond's team was discussing a countermeasure, Brian heard that cry again. He raised his scope and looked everywhere. This time, he clearly saw the opponent's figure. The scene before him made him repeatedly retreat in fear. Seeing Brian's reaction, Miller also picked up his scope and looked into the distance. However, apart from the pure white snow scene, he did not see the shadow Brian mentioned. Moreover, headquarters also announced that the satellite system did not show anyone around. But Brian was very sure he was not mistaken. But strangely, when he observed again, the shadow had disappeared. Miller urged him to leave. In desperation, Brian had to move with Miller to a safer nearby location. Along the way, the two discovered a U.S. military dagger in the snow. Clearly, this was something the previous team had dropped here. Just as the two were guessing about what had happened to that team, the familiar sound rang out again. Brian immediately aimed and saw the shadow lurking behind the trees. Miller saw his teammates' resolute attitude and took out his binoculars. But clearly, he and Brian were looking in the same direction, yet after careful observation for a while, they still couldn't find anyone. Seeing the opponent getting closer and closer, Brian decided that if it continued to advance, he would immediately open fire and kill it. Miller strongly advised him not to do so because once they opened fire, it would definitely alert the three armed gunmen from earlier. However, Brian couldn't care less. After aiming at the shadow, he decisively pulled the trigger, immediately taking down the figure in the trees. And after shooting down the target, Brian immediately reported the good news to Miller. But what he didn't expect was that the target he had just seen lying on the ground had vanished in the blink of an eye. What was worse was that the gunshot immediately alerted the three armed gunmen. They were now rapidly approaching them. Headquarters ordered them not to engage unless there was a direct threat. The Rain team had to find cover, then try to force the opponent to fire first. Soon, two masked men gradually approached. Seeing this, Miller rushed out from behind a large tree, intentionally exposing himself to force the opponent to fire. At the moment the opponent pulled the trigger, Miller acted first, shooting one of them in the head. Then Brian quickly dealt with the remaining one. But the strange thing was that there were clearly three people in that team earlier. Besides the two who had just been taken down, the other one had disappeared without a trace. Just as Miller was reporting the situation to headquarters, a more accurate bullet suddenly flew and hit him in the chest. Fortunately, he was wearing a bulletproof vest and survived. The shooter was none other than Mary, the female sniper from that team who had escaped death last time. Brian immediately changed position, raised his rifle, and searched everywhere for the opponent's location. But in front of him, besides the snow and dense forest, he could not find any suspicious places. No one expected that Mary was hiding in an ancient tree opposite. Her camouflage was almost perfect, so much so that headquarters satellite also did not detect her. To quickly end this confrontation, Brian realized he had to lure her out. Otherwise, if the opponent called for more reinforcements, it would be difficult for the two of them to escape, like birds with broken wings. Moreover, headquarters also stated that for safety reasons, they needed to eliminate this sniper before being allowed to retreat. They could not let their helicopter be exposed. After confirming that Miller was not seriously injured, Brian told him to stick his head out to lure the sniper to fire, the purpose of which was to help him lock onto the opponent's position. So Miller stuck his head out, and the next second, a bullet grazed him. Fortunately, this time it was just a slight tear, not causing a fatal injury to Miller. But what disappointed him was that Brian still hadn't found the opponent's position. This meant that Miller would have to sacrifice himself as bait again, but this time he refused to agree, even if it meant death. Another time he feared his head would fall to the ground. In a critical moment, Brian thought of a way to use a smoke grenade to distract the opponent and then seize the opportunity to escape. Fortunately, Miller only suffered minor abrasions and a broken rib, which temporarily did not affect his running speed. After confirming the feasible method, he immediately stood up and instructed Brian that this time he must lock onto the sniper's position. Next, he took out a smoke grenade, threw it to the ground, and then rushed with all his might towards a large tree not far away. Just as Mary thought victory was within her grasp, she did not expect this to be a trap that the opponent had set. She only hit the clothes that Raymond's team had placed earlier. By the time Mary realized she had been tricked, Brian's bullet had already embedded itself in her chest. Mary thus fell at her sniping position. After the danger was averted, Brian immediately went to find Miller to regroup. But after this encounter, the two had a disagreement. If Brian had not insisted on returning to the wooden house in the first place, they would not have encountered those 3 armed gunmen. But Brian believed that these people were not the threat. The biggest threat was the disappearing shadow behind the trees. He always felt that someone was watching them in the dark. Miller heard this and felt it was very unreasonable, because from beginning to end, he had never seen the shadow Brian was talking about. Moreover, even if there was one, with the current state of the Ron team, they could not confront the opponent directly. These words made Brian realize his own problem. After calming down, the two immediately reported to headquarters that the target had been dealt with, hoping the other party would approve their immediate withdrawal. But headquarters' response left both of them speechless, still waiting in place for new orders. After Miller's relentless questioning, the other party revealed that they had located the target, who was currently at a training ground 5 kilometers from the Rain team, who were the only operatives in this area. They were ordered to immediately proceed towards the target. Brian, after careful consideration, decided to report the matter of the shadow in the forest to headquarters. But Miller strongly discouraged him because once the superiors knew about this, Brian, who had actively opened fire, would not only have his withdrawal order revoked, but also face a 10-year psychological evaluation. In the end, the two decided to keep this matter a secret. After thoroughly discussing the action plan, they immediately proceeded towards the target's position. The two walked from day to night. During their rest, Brian saw that shadow again through his binoculars. This time, the opponent even walked straight to his side, causing Brian to immediately open fire. Miller was woken up, and as soon as he opened his eyes, he finally saw the shadow Brian was referring to. Just as the two were still stunned, the opponent suddenly appeared behind Miller and dragged him into the pitch-black forest. Brian heard Miller's desperate cries through the radio. Then he took out a glow stick and slowly approached the place where the opponent had disappeared. Finally, he saw Miller lying on the ground next to a large ancient tree. The strange thing was that the human shadow had disappeared without a trace. They realized this was not a place to stay long, so they immediately packed their gear and quickly left. The Rain team ran all night and finally reached the outer perimeter of the target's compound at dawn. To ensure the mission could be completed smoothly, Miller suggested Brian find the target. He, on the other hand, would always keep an eye on their rear to prevent the enemy from last night from catching up. As the two gradually approached the training ground, they clearly saw at least 8 armed gunmen in the courtyard, and each of them carried weapons. Clearly, direct engagement was impossible in this situation, and what made the two even more distressed was that their ammunition was almost depleted. If they opened fire, their position would definitely be exposed, and then it would be difficult to escape the enemy's hands. Given this situation, the Rain team decided to split up to facilitate a quick encirclement if something went wrong. At this moment, an opportunity arose. A group of people, led by the leader, walked out of the room, went to the training ground, and began target practice. Seeing this, Brian immediately aimed at the 3 people in front, then one shot pierced through them, taking down all 3 at once. With the 3 simultaneously falling to the ground, the battle officially began and the armed gunmen scattered in all directions. Brian seized the opportunity to aim at the target and decisively opened fire, but only injured the opponent's arm. At this moment, 2 people were closing in on Miller's hiding position. Seeing this, Brian immediately opened fire to provide cover. With their seamless coordination, they quickly eliminated all the enemies. Seeing that the target, Ick, was still struggling in agony, headquarters ordered Brian to immediately shoot him down. However, Brian suddenly remembered the innocent civilian who had been mistakenly killed. The previous experience made him dare not fire indiscriminately. Although headquarters and Miller repeatedly urged him, Brian still did not have the courage to pull the trigger. Miller couldn't stand it anymore and had to step out himself, firing several consecutive shots at the old man on the ground. But just as he reported the target's death to headquarters, a more accurate bullet unexpectedly flew and took down Miller. And the shooter was none other than Mary, the female sniper who had narrowly escaped death last time. Seeing this, Brian searched everywhere for her position. Miller struggled to get up with his injured body, trying to stand, but because of his severe wounds, he could only limp away with difficulty. Finally, he desperately fell to the ground, awaiting death. In a haze, he saw the figure from last night approaching. Brian saw the opponent remove Miller's hood, then he turned and ran for his life, not even having time to gather the weapons on the ground. However, the opponent quickly caught up. Mary saw this scene and was utterly terrified, immediately packed her gear and left the scene. Brian, at his wit's end, removed his gear, drew his dagger, and prepared to fight the opponent. But the strange thing was that when he rushed towards the shadow, it calmly turned its back and walked away. Brian frantically searched around where he stood. But unexpectedly, the moment he turned around, the opponent suddenly rushed out from behind, pinned Brian against a tree trunk, and stabbed him through the stomach. Until the very end, all his belongings were pulled out. But what no one expected was that a few moments later, Brian got up again, and the wound in his stomach had disappeared. Then he immediately reported to headquarters. The mission was successfully completed, taking down 9 people, including the target. Unfortunately, Miller had fallen. And so, Brian completed the mission and returned to the U.S. The officer in charge stated that although he had dealt with the target during the operation, he had lost his weapon and had also delayed firing. He believed that given what Brian had experienced this time, he probably needed to see a psychiatrist. After Brian returned home, his wife noticed that he had become completely different. Even when his beloved daughter ran to him, Brian's face showed no expression. At night, when he slept, terrifying images constantly flashed through his mind, and even hallucinations detached from reality appeared. His daughter was clearly standing healthy in front of him, but the next second she was pierced by a bullet, and his wife also walked out of the room covered in blood. Brian woke up in a panic, grabbed the gun next to him, and fired wildly. Only then did he realize it was just a nightmare. His wife heard the noise and ran over to see the TV in front of them shattered. She realized that things couldn't continue like this. If Brian lost control and fired at his family, the consequences would be unimaginable. Therefore, his wife suggested he move out for a while. But only Brian knew that this was not simply a nightmare, feeling that the more he thought about it, the worse it got. He sought out the officer in charge to question him about what the previous mission was all about. Why there was a person in the wooden house with exactly the same characteristics as the target, according to intelligence. Under Brian's persistent questioning, the officer in charge finally revealed the truth. It turned out that the person killed in the wooden house was actually the target IKE's brother. Before that, the CIA didn't know where IKE was hiding, so they intentionally made Brian and his teammate believe that his brother was the real target. After the fake target was killed, IKE would definitely seek revenge for his brother. So they set this trap to lure the snake out of its hole. Brian was extremely disappointed to learn the truth, not expecting the military to use such despicable tactics. He decided to resign immediately. When he got home, he confessed everything to his wife. But about that shadow, he didn't know how to begin. At this moment, a knock suddenly sounded at the door. He cautiously went to the window to look. Through the glass, he was horrified to discover the wooden door of the shed outside shaking, exactly like what he had seen in the snow. Brian shouted loudly, telling his wife to take their daughter and leave. Although his wife didn't know what was happening, she still ran into the room, woke her sleeping daughter, and tried to escape. Brian, in a panic, immediately drew his gun because he felt that the shadow was definitely lurking in some corner and silently watching him. Waiting for his wife to take their daughter outside, he looked through the window and saw his own reflection. His wife was worried about leaving her husband at home alone. After settling their daughter, she returned to the room and saw Brian sitting on the bed, his mind in a state of panic. Just as she was about to go comfort him, Brian suddenly fired wildly into the room. Seeing this, his wife pleaded with him to stop. This brought Brian's nearly broken sanity back. Their daughter, seeing her parents doing nothing, couldn't help but get out of the car and go into the house to check. She saw the two sitting on the ground, still dazed. Not long after, Brian seemed to have returned to normal. The shadow that had been constantly with him in the snow seemed to be just an illusion arising in his mind. Every time he pulled the trigger and ended a life, fear would cling to his bones like a disease. Perhaps for Brian, who had experienced the ravages of war, putting down the cold gun and returning to his family was the only cure for his emotional wounds. The story ends here. The value of a movie lies in its reputation, and the value of a movie review lies in its feeling. Today's story ends here. Thank you for watching. What do you think of this movie?